Emily Harper pulled on her gloves as the morning light poured into Golden Pines Community Hospital. The halls were quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors. She glanced at the chart in her hand, then at the old man wheeled past Walter Briggs' Korean War vet 82 chest tightness overnight. A sharp, piercing sound cracked the stillness. Emily froze. "Code blue," someone shouted down the hall. Emily dropped the chart. Her sneakers hit the floor fast. She reached Walt's stretcher as the heart monitor flatlined. "Stay with me, Walt," Emily muttered under her breath, pressing her hands to his chest. From the doorway, Chief Nurse Deborah Klein's voice cut through the tension. "Emily, that's not your patient." Emily didn't look up. "He is now." Her hands pumped steady and hard. 1 minute passed, then two. A soft gasp rattled in Walt's throat. His chest rose. Emily sat back, chest heaving as footsteps thundered toward her. And that's when everything changed. Golden Pines Community Hospital sat quietly under a blanket of snow, its modest brick walls barely standing out against the pale Montana winter. Inside, the early morning shift had just started. Emily Harper, 55, moved through the hallways with the practiced ease of someone who had given her life to this place. For over 3 decades, she had seen it all: births, broken bones, heart attacks, and moments of quiet triumph. But on this morning, something stirred in her gut. She passed by room 214, glancing at the new admission. Walt Briggs, 82 years old. Walt wore a faded Korean War veteran's cap that sat slightly crooked on his thinning white hair. His chart listed chest tightness overnight, transfer from a local clinic, history of high blood pressure, and a pacemaker. Emily paused at the doorway for a second, noting the soft rise and fall of his chest. He was asleep, his lined face calm, oxygen tubing resting under his nose. Emily smiled faintly and continued down the hall. The hospital was still waking up. The coffee machine sputtered in the nurse's station. Orderlies rolled carts past, and the familiar hum of monitors filled the background. Emily was halfway through reviewing a chart when it happened: the sharp, unmistakable sound of a flatline. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then instinct kicked in. Emily's eyes shot to the source. Room 214. She sprinted down the hall, her shoes pounding the linoleum. She shoved the door open, saw Walt's motionless body, his chest still, the heart monitor screaming. "Code blue!" Emily shouted, voice cutting through the air like a bell. Without hesitation, she dropped the clipboard to the floor, hands moving fast. She lowered the bed rail, pressed her palms against Walt's chest, interlocked her fingers, and began compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4, she counted under her breath. No doctor, no backup. A nurse from the next room poked her head out, eyes wide. "Get the crash cart," Emily yelled. Every second stretched like an hour. Emily's arms ached as she fought to keep the rhythm. Her heart pounded, sweat beaded at her temple, and still no sign of a doctor. The camera would hold on this image: a veteran fighting for breath and a nurse refusing to let him go. This was the moment that would change everything. Emily's arms trembled as she pumped Walt's chest, but she didn't let up. Every beat of her hands was measured, precise. 30 compressions, 2 breaths again. She could hear the shuffle of feet as the other nurses ran to get the crash cart, but no one reached her side. Emily didn't wait for authorization. She didn't have time. "Come on, Walt. Stay with me," she murmured, sweat dripping down her brow. The heart monitor still screamed in a flat, steady line. After nearly 2 long minutes, minutes that felt like an eternity, Walt's chest jerked. His mouth opened slightly and a soft gasp rattled from his throat. "There you are," Emily whispered, letting out a shaky breath as the monitor stuttered and then picked up a faint, uneven rhythm. The crash cart arrived just as Walt's eyes fluttered and an orderly ran to help. But before Emily could even step back, a sharp voice sliced through the room. "Emily, step away." Chief Nurse Deborah Klein strode in, her heels clicking against the floor. Deborah, 45, was everything Emily wasn't. Crisp, cold, precise, and fiercely loyal to hospital protocol. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painful. She scanned the scene with narrowed eyes, her gaze landing not on Walt, but on Emily. "Emily Harper," Deborah said in a tone that carried across the room, "you were not assigned to this patient." Emily stood still, catching her breath, I was closest, she replied simply. You violated protocol, Deborah snapped. You were outside your assigned ward. You had no authorization to intervene. The room fell silent except for the beep of the heart monitor and Walt's labored breaths. Emily looked around familiar faces, some avoiding her eyes, others filled with quiet sympathy. Deborah reached into her pocket and pulled out a badge. Effective immediately, you're suspended, pending investigation. Turn in your ID. Emily's fingers brushed her badge, her mouth a firm line. For a moment, her heart pounded louder than the monitor. She felt every eye in the room on her, waiting to see if she would break. With a calmness honed from decades in this place, Emily unclipped her badge and placed it gently into Deborah's outstretched hand. I'd do it again, Emily said quietly, locking eyes with her supervisor. Then she turned, head held high, and walked out, leaving behind a stunned silence. Emily walked down the long hospital hallway, the quiet shuffle of her sneakers, the only sound in her ears. Without her ID badge clipped to her scrubs, she felt strangely untethered, like she no longer belonged in the place she had called home for over 30 years. In the break room, Emily sat at the small table near the window, staring out at the snowy Montana parking lot. Her fingers toyed absent-mindedly with a coffee mug, the one a grateful patient's family had given her years ago. The words "best nurse ever" were faded from countless trips through the dishwasher, but she could still trace them by touch. Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, a message from Janice, one of the night shift nurses. You did the right thing, but management is panicking. I'm sorry. Emily smiled faintly, typing a short reply. Thank you. It's okay. But was it? In all her years of nursing, Emily had never been written up, let alone suspended. She'd survived 3 hospital administrators, 2 major renovations, flu epidemics, supply shortages, and staff turnovers. She had trained half the younger nurses on this floor, and now for saving a man's life, she was packing up her locker. Across the glass walls of the break room, Emily saw staff hurrying by, some casting sympathetic glances her way, others too nervous to look. Hospital politics were as old as medicine itself. No one wanted to be the next to get in trouble. As she placed her stethoscope into her bag, Emily's thoughts drifted to Walt. She wondered if he'd remember her face when he woke up. She wondered if anyone would tell him what happened. A knock at the door startled her. Deborah stood there, arms crossed, face unreadable. You're expected at the administration office at noon, Deborah said shortly. Emily nodded, standing up without a word. As she moved toward the door, Deborah hesitated. You put this hospital in a very difficult position, Deborah added, her voice slightly lower. Emily met her eyes. No, she said calmly. I put a heartbeat back in that man's chest. And with that, she walked past her supervisor, the break room door swinging closed behind her. And in that moment, Emily knew the real fight was just beginning. The conference room smelled faintly of stale coffee and lemon disinfectant. Emily sat at one end of the long table, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes calm but alert. Across from her sat the review panel, the hospital administrator, the head of HR, a legal advisor, and of course, chief nurse Deborah Klein. The administrator, a man in his 50s with thinning gray hair, cleared his throat and shuffled some papers. Nurse Harper, you understand why we're here today? Emily nodded. I understand you're questioning why I saved a man's life. There was a flicker of tension in the room. Deborah leaned forward. This isn't about the outcome, Emily. It's about procedure. You stepped outside your assigned floor. You intervened without authorization. Emily took a slow breath. And if I hadn't, Walter Briggs would be dead right now. The legal advisor, a younger woman with sharp eyes, tapped her pen on the folder. The hospital is liable when staff act beyond their scope of assignment. This is not just a question of ethics. It's a question of risk management. Emily felt a familiar warmth rise in her chest, the kind that always came when someone spoke about medicine, like it was a business deal. She leaned slightly forward. When you hire a nurse, you hire someone trained to respond to emergencies. We don't get to schedule cardiac arrests. The room fell uncomfortably quiet. The administrator coughed and tried to steer the meeting back. We'll be reviewing the security footage and speaking with staff. Until then, your suspension stands. At that moment, Emily noticed a figure in the hallway, watching through the glass, a tall man in a worn leather jacket and cowboy hat. He had the unmistakable posture of a soldier. As soon as their eyes met, he nodded once and walked away. Phone pressed to his ear. Emily's stomach tightened with a flicker of curiosity. Who was he? Back in her locker room, Emily gathered her things slowly, each item heavy with memory: her stethoscope, the old mug, the folded thank you cards. She could hear the muffled sounds of the hospital still bustling outside. Call buttons, announcements, hurried footsteps. And as she slipped her coat over her shoulders, Emily couldn't help but wonder, was this the end of her career, or just the beginning of something she hadn't seen coming? The next morning, the air in Golden Pines Community Hospital buzzed with something unusual, tension mixed with a ripple of curiosity. Staff whispered near the nurse's station, glancing toward the administrative wing. Word had spread that someone important was on site. Emily, who had come in only to clean out the last of her locker, felt it the moment she walked through the door. Heads turned, a young orderly rushed past, nearly bumping into her. Emily, Janice whispered, catching up to her, "You need to see this." At the end of the hall near the conference room stood a tall figure in full military dress uniform. His presence demanded attention without a word. Silver hair under a crisp cap, polished boots, medals, gleaming Colonel Robert Mason. Army Liaison Officer. Emily's heart skipped. Inside the conference room, the administrator's voice wavered. "Colonel Mason, we appreciate your concern, but this is an internal matter." Colonel Mason raised a hand, not to silence, but to steady. His voice was measured, low and unshakably firm. "I understand Nurse Harper's suspension was for stepping outside her assignment. I'm here to tell you that the man she saved is Staff Sergeant Walter Briggs, Korean, wore 3 tours, Purple Heart, Silver Star, and without Nurse Harper, he wouldn't be alive today." There was a shuffle of papers, a cough, an uncomfortable silence. Deborah Klein sat, frozen lips tight, while the legal advisor's pen hovered above her notes. Mason continued, placing a small, velvet box on the table and sliding it forward. "Sergeant Briggs gave this nation everything, and Nurse Harper gave him something back: his life. I strongly suggest you reconsider your position." Emily watched from the doorway, stunned as the colonel's words settled over the room like a weight no one wanted to lift. Inside, the administrator cleared his throat. "We'll review the footage again and revisit the suspension." Colonel Mason's eyes flicked toward the window, locking onto Emily's. His nod was small, but it felt like a handshake across the distance. As Emily turned to leave the hallway, seemed brighter. The faces she passed, less guarded, whispers, softened eyes, met hers with something that hadn't been there the day before: respect. For the first time in days, Emily allowed herself the smallest, quietest smile. Something had shifted, and the hospital wasn't quite the same anymore. By that afternoon, the hospital atmosphere had completely shifted. Emily returned not as a nurse packing her things, but as someone summoned, this time to be heard. In the conference room, the administrator greeted her with a stiff smile, noticeably more careful in his tone. Deborah Klein, who had once led the charge for Emily's suspension, sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes lowered. The legal advisor barely glanced up from her notes, but at the head of the table sat Colonel Mason, calm and steady, his military posture unshaken. "Harper," the administrator began, "we've reviewed the footage and the testimonies." He cleared his throat, glancing at Deborah. "In light of new context, the suspension is lifted. We recognize that your intervention was critical in saving Mr. Briggs's life." Emily nodded slightly, arms resting calmly on the table. But it was Colonel Mason who leaned forward next. "That's not enough," Mason said, his voice quiet but firm. "Recognition matters, not just for Nurse Harper, but for your entire staff. You have nurses here who need to know that doing the right thing matters more than just following a checklist." For a moment, no one spoke. The administrator shifted uncomfortably, then nodded. "We agree, and we will review our emergency protocols to allow greater flexibility during life-threatening events." Emily took a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked toward Deborah, half expecting more resistance. But to her surprise, the usually unyielding chief nurse gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Colonel Mason reached into his pocket and placed a folded letter on the table. "This," he said, tapping it gently, "comes from the Briggs family. They want you to know you didn't just save a veteran, you saved a father, a grandfather, a man who served his country with everything he had, and they're grateful." As the meeting ended, Emily stood and shook the colonel's hand, feeling the quiet strength in his grip. Walking out of the room, the hospital felt different beneath her feet, as if the walls themselves had softened the burden of silence. Lifting staff watched her with new eyes, no longer glancing away, no longer whispering behind hands. For Emily, it wasn't just about winning back her job. It was about reclaiming the heart of the place she had served for 3 decades. And as she stepped into the corridor, she knew change had finally walked through these doors. Emily walked slowly toward the ICU, the place where it had all started. Her badge was clipped firmly back onto her scrubs, and for the first time in days she felt the familiar weight of it. Not as a punishment, but as a badge of honor. She paused just outside room 214. Through the glass, she saw Walt Briggs propped up in his hospital bed, pale but awake. His Korean War veteran cap now rested on the tray table beside him, and his eyes, still sharp despite age, flickered with quiet amusement as his son Tom Briggs, the tall man in the cowboy hat, sat nearby, recounting a story that made the old soldier laugh softly. Emily tapped lightly on the doorframe. Tom looked up and smiled. Walt's gaze followed, and recognition lit his face. "You," Walt rasped, his voice thin but steady. "You're the one they told me about." Emily stepped in her hands, gently adjusting the IV line as she moved to his bedside. "Just doing my job." "Mr. Briggs," she said with a soft smile. Walt's hand, thin, liver-spotted, but still surprisingly strong, reached for hers. "I pulled men out of burning trucks," he murmured, eyes misting over dragged friends out of the jungle. "Never thought someone would pull me back one day." Emily gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "That's how it works. Walt, we look out for each other." Tom, standing quietly nearby, gave a small nod of thanks before slipping out to give them a moment. As Emily stood there, the tension of the past few days began to fall away. She saw in Walt's eyes what she had always known. This work was not about paperwork or policies. It was about people, moments, and the invisible thread that connects us all. When Emily left the room, she found Deborah Klein waiting near the nurse's station. For once, the chief nurse's rigid posture had softened, and after a moment's hesitation, she spoke. "Emily," Deborah began, her voice quieter than usual, "I owe you an apology, a public one." Before Emily could reply, Deborah turned toward the gathered nurses at the shift change and raised her voice. "Everyone, I need to acknowledge something. Nurse Harper's actions saved a life this week, and I was wrong to punish her for it. Starting today, we will revise our emergency protocols." The room was silent for a beat. Then slowly the staff began to clap. First one nurse, then another, until the small hallway filled with applause. Emily felt her face flush with unexpected emotion. For the first time in days, she realized she was home again. 1 month later, the hospital looked and felt transformed. The emergency protocols had been rewritten. The staff had been retrained, and on the ICU whiteboard, in bold blue marker, were the words, "The Emily Code." A new standard authorizing any qualified nurse to intervene during life-threatening emergencies, no matter the assigned ward. Emily walked down the familiar hallway, a fresh cup of coffee in hand, her steps slower but purposeful. The chatter of nurses at the station was warmer now, sprinkled with laughter and the easy rhythm of a team that had been through something hard together and come out stronger. As she passed room 214, Emily couldn't help but glance, and Walt Briggs was no longer there. He had been discharged 2 weeks ago, sent home with his family, and a stack of thank you letters for the hospital staff. But in his place, a small frame photo now hung on the wall. Walt standing in his backyard, surrounded by his grandchildren, grinning beneath that faded Korean War cap. Below the photo, a handwritten note, "To Nurse Emily Harper, with all our gratitude." Emily smiled, adjusting her badge and continuing her rounds. Out on the front lawn, a new flagpole had been installed, a gift from Walt's family and local veterans, with a brass plaque at its base reading, "In honor of those who serve and those who save." Every morning, the maintenance team raised the flag with quiet ceremony, and sometimes, if Emily timed her break just right, she'd sip her coffee outside and watch the stars and stripes rise against the Montana sky. It hadn't been easy these last few weeks. There were heated meetings, resistance from some hospital leadership, endless paperwork, and plenty of late nights. But the shift was undeniable. Younger nurses now looked to Emily not just as a veteran nurse, but as a mentor. Even Deborah Klein had softened often, stopping by Emily's desk to ask for her input on policy changes, something Emily never thought she'd see. One afternoon, as Emily sat at the nurse's station reviewing charts, Tom Briggs walked into the hospital carrying a wooden box. He smiled warmly when he saw her. "Dad wanted you to have this," he said, setting the box down gently. Inside was Walt's Korean war cap, cleaned and carefully preserved, along with a folded American flag and a handwritten note. "Thank you for being the one who didn't wait." Emily's throat tightened as she ran her fingers over the cap's fabric, the history in its stitching. She looked up at Tom, who simply nodded, his own eyes damp. When Tom left, Emily sat quietly for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle in. She thought about how sometimes real change came, not from grand gestures, but from one person deciding to do what was right, even when the rules said otherwise. As the sun set over the hospital, casting long golden rays across the hallway floor, Emily straightened her shoulders and tucked Walt's cap gently into her locker. There would be more patients, more emergencies, more moments where instinct mattered more than protocol. But now, thanks to one choice, the hospital was ready, and so was she. The following weeks unfolded like chapters in a new book at Golden Pines Community Hospital. Emily had been asked to lead the newly formed Emergency Response Committee, a team created to review, update, and train staff on what was now officially known as the Emily Code. For the first time in her career, she found herself not only saving lives at bedsides, but shaping how lives would be saved across the entire hospital. Meetings were scheduled early in the mornings, before the first coffee break, or late in the afternoon, when most staff were thinking of dinner. But Emily was there every time, sleeves rolled up, notebook in hand, listening to the younger nurses, orderlies, even janitors who often had no voice in the conversation. She wanted their ideas, their experiences. One morning, Emily stood in front of a group of nurses explaining the new procedures. Behind her was a large projector screen displaying real case simulations. "What matters," she told the group, "is not waiting. If you see someone in trouble, you move, you act. Because a human life doesn't care what department you're assigned to." The room was quiet. Then a nurse from pediatrics raised her hand and said, "You know, I used to hesitate if it wasn't on my floor. I won't anymore." Emily gave a small smile. "That's the idea." Outside the hospital, things had changed as well. The new flagpole stood tall near the entrance, and each morning a small group of veterans from town would gather to watch the flag go up. Sometimes Emily caught them glancing toward the building, tipping their caps when they saw her through the glass doors. It was a quiet acknowledgement, one that meant more to her than words. Walt Briggs's family had become almost honorary members of the hospital family. Tom Briggs often stopped by with coffee for the night shift or dropped off baked goods for the staff. Walt himself called occasionally from home, updating Emily on his recovery and telling her how he was chasing the grandkids around the yard, slowly, but still chasing. One afternoon after her rounds, Emily walked the perimeter of the hospital grounds, something she rarely had time for before. She paused under the new flagpole, looking up as the fabric rippled in the breeze. Standing there, she thought of the old ways, the old rules, how long they had gone, unquestioned, and how much fear had held people back from doing what was right. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky with pink and gold. Emily took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. She knew there would always be more to fix, more to fight for. There were still policies buried in dusty binders that needed rewriting. Still young nurses who would freeze up when moments of crisis arrived. But now they had a guide. As she turned to walk back inside, Emily felt a quiet confidence settle in her chest. This hospital, this place she had given so much of her life to, had finally found its way back to its purpose. And Emily Harper, after 30 years of service, had not only saved a life, she had helped save the heart of the hospital itself.